In today's video, we'll be learning about a nation of people known as the Dakota. The Dakota have been living in Minnesota longer than anybody else. How long?
Well, the Dakota have lived in Minnesota for at least several hundred, but possibly more than 1,000 years. It's possible that some of the prehistoric people we learned about in Chapter 2 are the ancestors of the Dakota.
Like most cultures around the world, the history of the Dakota was handed down from generation to generation through oral tradition. Just so that you know, oral tradition is the custom of telling stories about the histories and legends of a group in order to teach about that culture.
Most cultures throughout most of the world, for most of history, have told their stories using oral tradition. If you always tell stories about your family members instead of having a written record of everything, then you use oral tradition as well. If you tell your friends about your day rather than write, type, or text it, then you are also using oral tradition. When you use oral tradition, you usually rely on the people who know the most history to tell the stories.
Your grandma knows a lot more about the history of the family than you do, because she's seen things change so much. If you have elders in your life, I strongly recommend that you chat with them and somehow record their stories. Turn that oral tradition, that oral history, into written history. You won't realize how good of an idea this is until your elders are gone. And when you lose them, you lose their stories and their oral traditions.
So we already told you that the Dakota are the oldest tribe in Minnesota, but are they still around? Yes, they are, in fact. Today in Minnesota, there are 50,000 people who can be considered American Indian. The second largest group of American Indians in Minnesota today are Dakota. Anishinaabe are the largest group, and we'll talk about them in a future video.
Just a few more numbers to give you. There are a total of 5.2 million American Indians in the United States, and 170,000 of them are Dakota. The Dakota Nation was larger than Minnesota and only included the western half of the state. That's why most Dakota today live in North and South Dakota. I wonder where those two states got their name.
Historians believe that prior to 1492, the American Indian population living in what we now call the United States was around 15 million and 100% of the population. Over the next 400 years, that number dropped to only 250,000, a loss of 14.75 million people. Over the last 120 years, the American Indian population has increased again, and today there are around 5.2 million American Indians in the U.S., making up a little over 1% of the national population.
Oh, this is a good time to clear something up. Sometimes you'll hear people talk about the Sioux. This is another name for the Dakota, but it's not a very nice name. Yeah, it means snake people, and the name comes from the Anishinaabe, who were the rivals with the Dakota. When French fur traders moving west through the Great Lakes came across Anishinaabe, they asked them, "Who are those people to the west of you over there?" And the Anishinaabe said, "Oh yeah, those are the snake people." Only they said it in Anishinaabe, and they used the word Nadasu, which is the Anishinaabe word for snake. And it turns out they weren't actually even calling them snake people like an insult. They were actually saying that they're the people who live by the Snake River, because in Minnesota, most of the Dakota population lived right by what we now know today as the Snake River. So it wasn't even an insult, but it became one, and that's why Sioux is not a name that we really use very much. Dakota is the word.
One more thing to clear up. We said American Indian, but you'll also hear Native American and just plain Native. What's the correct word? All three are okay, but the best answer is to call somebody by their specific tribal name. If you know that somebody is Dakota, call them a Dakota person rather than an American Indian or Native American.
My ancestors are Norwegian, and you say, oh, you have Norwegian ancestry, not European. It's just more specific to go with that. Okay, so let's get back to the history of the Dakota. Wait, why are we learning about the Dakota? Isn't this Minnesota?
Duh, rewind to the first thing we said in the video.
The Dakota have been living in Minnesota longer than anybody else. How long? Well, the Dakota have lived in Minnesota for at least several hundred, but possibly more than 1,000 years. Oh yeah, I remember that. Boy, this video sure aged pretty tough in just a few minutes' time.
It's called special effects. Duh.
Okay, there's four main groups of Dakota: the Midwaugan, the Sisseton, the Wahpeton, and the Wapukate. Located in Minnesota and western Wisconsin, The Dakota have lived for countless generations along the wooded shores of the region's lakes and rivers. They harvested wild rice, maple sugar, and cultivated gardens. They were a semi-nomadic people, which means that they moved around throughout the year, but to the same places year after year. Huh?
Well, when it was fall, wild rice harvest time, they were by the lakes and rivers. When it was maple sugar time, come March, they were among the maples. In the summer, they cultivated gardens and spent time near the prairies and river valleys. Except for those seasonal movements, they spent most of the year in villages that featured bark longhouses. These villages each had a chief, much like each town in the United States has a mayor. These chiefs also got together as a larger nation, much like our Congress, and would make decisions democratically, including voting for a Speaker of the Nation who would represent the people in all formal settings.
The Dakota interacted with their neighboring nations in a variety of ways. For example, the Dakota regularly traded with other tribes across the Great Plains of the continent. One of the favorite tribes to trade with were the Arikara. The Dakota would trade buffalo hides and meat to the Arikara in exchange for corn. Not all interactions were positive. Because the Dakota lands were large, they had a lot of neighbors. They frequently competed with the Assiniboine Nation, the Kiowa, and the Anishinaabe of northern and eastern Minnesota. Now, how did they communicate with each other if they didn't speak the same language? All these tribes spoke different languages, but they used sign language to communicate.
The competition between the Anishinaabe and the Dakota intensified in the early 1600s when French fur traders started moving into the Great Lakes. Those fur traders were after beaver pelts and other animals and would trade manufactured goods with the American Indians. Around the same time, the Anishinaabe were migrating their nation west for a variety of reasons. These Anishinaabe were pushing into the areas traditionally occupied by the Dakota, causing extra competition both for resources but also for trading rights.
Think about it this way. You and another student are working at a table and have enough space. The two of you occasionally get your papers mixed up with one another, but the problems are rather easily solved. Then somebody else comes to the room and starts trading with you and the other kid. Because they're closer to that other kid, you aren't able to trade as easily.
To make matters worse, they're calling you names to the new kid and trying to take more of your table away. Think there are some problems coming up? You got that right.
In the early 1600s, French fur traders started trade negotiations with the Dakota. Throughout the following century, trade production increased drastically, with fur trapping and trading becoming the primary occupation of Dakota people. With more and more Europeans coming, the fur industry was booming. There was also an increase of guns in the area, and food sources were becoming strained. Competitive fights turned into deadly battles, and a war-like atmosphere between the Anishinaabe and Dakota became a regular occurrence.
Throughout the 1700s, missionaries increased their presence throughout the region. As France's power in the colonies began to slow down, the British became the dominant Europeans in the area. The British negotiated a number of treaties with the Dakota. Meanwhile, missionaries worked to turn the Dakota language into an alphabet and written language.
By the early 1800s, the United States of America started to negotiate treaties with the Dakota Nation. Rather than trade with the Dakota, like the French and the British, the U.S. was looking to gain more land and remove the Dakota from the growing European community.
In 1851, with diminished food resources, increased hostilities, and outright deception, the Dakota chiefs had little choice but to sign a treaty ceding all land in Minnesota except for 2 strips of land on both sides of the Minnesota River.
A decade later, those lands would be lost as well, except for a few small reservations that still exist today, known as the Upper Sioux, Lower Sioux, Prairie Island, and Mdewakanton Indian communities.
Are those the only places where the Dakota people of today live?
Not at all. Many of them live there on those reservations, but Dakota people also live all over the state. Many of them live on the reservations, but Dakota people also live all over the state. Right now, I just happen to be in Minneapolis, and there's a lot of Dakota who live right here in Minneapolis. But they also live in Rochester, and St. Paul, and Rogers, and Otsego, and Elk River as well. So, hopefully you learned a little bit about the Dakota. Have a great day.
Stop.